Welcome back to Midnight Evidence. I know many of you come here when the world goes quiet, when you need something dark but strangely comforting to guide you into sleep or to keep you company through a long, solitary shift at work. Because of that, we are stepping into a new chapter. Starting tonight, I will be bringing you massive, long-form videos designed to play for hours. I've carefully crafted the pacing and use strategic silence so that the psychological suspense never jolts you, but rather pulls you deeper into sensory isolation. Whether you're chained to a desk or drifting off in the dark, you can let these stories run completely uninterrupted. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you always have a place to return to when it gets late. Just turn the lights low, put on your headphones, and let the night take over. The vibration of my phone against my thigh was the first tremor of the nightmare. The heavy oak doors of the lecture hall had just swung shut behind me, cutting off the dull drone of the passing students. The hallway was dim, quiet. I pulled the phone from my pocket, the harsh glare of the screen illuminating the empty corridor. One new voicemail. From my father. My mother was the caller, the checker, the worrier. She filled the silence of my college years with trivial updates and nervous questions. My father, however, was a man of profound, immovable silences. He only reached out when the very foundation of our world cracked. Seeing his caller ID, a cold, suffocating dread coiled tight in the base of my throat. I knew it had to be bad. I just couldn't fathom the depths of the horror waiting for me. I raised the phone to my ear, my pulse quickening in the empty hall. The recording hissed with hollow, empty static for 3 agonizing seconds before he finally spoke. "We are buying you a plane ticket." His voice was stripped of anything human. "You need to fly home tonight." A long, heavy pause weighed down the line. "There has been an accident. Call me when you get this." Click. Nothing more. The silence that followed was deafening. I dialed him back immediately, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the device. When he finally answered, his voice sounded distant, like it belonged to a ghost. He explained the reality of the situation in clipped, clinical terms. My grandfather, the sprawling, overgrown cornfield, the massive, churning steel blades of the old combine harvester. An accident. He didn't describe what my grandmother saw when she went out into the field looking for him. He didn't have to. The shock of finding whatever was left of her husband had seized her chest, stopping her heart right there in the dirt before the paramedics could even cross the county line. The flight home was a waking nightmare. I have never done well with the suffocating confines of small spaces, and the airplane cabin felt like a descending metal coffin. The recycled air scraped against the inside of my lungs. The pressure in my head was unbearable. I needed a cigarette. I needed the burning, grounding sensation of smoke in my chest. Without it, my claustrophobia amplified into a dull, throbbing panic. I spent the entire agonizing flight pacing the narrow, carpeted aisles, walking back and forth to the cramped restroom. Not to use it, just to move, just to keep the encroaching walls from crushing me. When the plane finally touched down on the tarmac, the oppressive weight of reality settled over my shoulders. My father was already standing in the shadows of the concrete parking garage. His sudden presence shattered my quiet plan of stealing a long, desperate drag of nicotine before facing him. He looked 10 years older, hollowed out by a grief he refused to show. He wrapped his arms around me in a stiff, desperate hug, pulling away quickly before wordlessly taking my duffel bag and shoving it into the trunk of his sedan. My hands shook. I couldn't take the trembling anymore. The urge was too deep, too visceral. I pulled a cigarette from my pocket right there in the echoing, exhaust-stained garage, clamped it between my lips, and struck the flint of my lighter. My father had never seen me smoke. I forced my posture to remain casual, feigning an indifference I did not feel. He stood by the open trunk, pausing with his hand resting on the cold metal. He simply raised one weary eyebrow at me, the heavy silence stretching between us like a physical weight. I braced for the inevitable lecture, the sudden outburst of pent-up anger. Instead, he just gave a slow, defeated nod. "That is a nice lighter," he murmured. I looked down at my hands. I hadn't realized my thumb was compulsively flicking the brass lid open and shut, the metallic clink echoing off the concrete walls. I held out the vintage trench lighter. Heavy. Cold. My girlfriend found it, I offered quietly. An antique store on the coast. A few weeks ago, he took it. His calloused thumb brushed the worn, tarnished brass. He inspected it under the flickering fluorescent lights of the garage, nodding approvingly before handing it back to me. "No smoking in the car," he instructed, his voice entirely flat. "Your mother would never let us hear the end of it." The sharp sting of the smoke hitting my lungs had already chased away the worst of the trembling. My headache began to recede into the background. I dropped the half-smoked cigarette onto the oil-stained concrete and ground it into total oblivion beneath the heel of my boot. An hour later, we pulled into the gravel driveway of my childhood home. The house felt entirely different. Stripped of its warmth, my mother practically collapsed into my arms the moment I stepped through the door, burying her face in my shoulder. When she finally stepped back, wiping her eyes, she looked me up and down. She caught the faint, lingering scent of tobacco clinging to my jacket. "Your father used to smoke menthols too when he was your age," she said, her voice trembling as she forced a weak, fleeting smirk toward my dad. I wasn't sure if I was more embarrassed that she had caught me, or entirely shocked that my rigid, disciplined father used to possess the same vice. He didn't meet her eyes. He just gave me a heavy pat on the shoulder and walked silently deeper into the darkened house. We spent that evening going through the motions of catching up. They asked about my classes. I asked about their auto shop. They filled me in on how the business was bleeding money, but they were doing whatever they could to keep their heads above the rising water. Eventually, the room grew quiet, and my dad laid out the grim reality of the funeral. They had decided on closed caskets. For both of them, the injuries my grandfather had sustained from the harvester were far too catastrophic, far too gruesome to allow anyone to see him, and they ordered a closed casket for my grandmother too. If hers was open and his was closed, people would whisper. People would ask questions. The silence of two sealed wooden boxes was easier to bear than the morbid curiosity of a small farming town. The next morning, the funeral was a bleak, hollow affair. Only a handful of people showed up. My grandparents were in their late 80s. The vast majority of the people who would have mourned them were already in the ground. The overcast sky threatened rain that never came, leaving the air feeling thick and suffocating. Afterward, we returned to the suffocating quiet of my parents' house and picked at plates of cold food. "Son," my father began, his voice breaking the stillness of the dining room, "your mom and I have talked about this extensively. We need to sell your grandparents' farm." He stared down at his untouched plate. "We have neither the time nor the money to maintain it. The property taxes alone will drown us. If you can take a week off from your classes, go out there, box up their lives, clean the place up, get it ready for the realtors, we will give you 25% of whatever the land sells for." I took a large bite of dry chicken, chewing it methodically as the weight of the request settled over me. I could call the university. I could explain the tragedy. My professors would grant me the extensions. "Yeah," I finally nodded. "I can do that." "But what do you mean, clean it up? How bad is the house?" My father and mother exchanged a long, deeply troubled look. My mother lowered her eyes back to her lap, her hands wringing a paper napkin into shreds. "Just before your grandfather passed," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the table, "your grandmother called me in a panic. She told me the doctors had diagnosed him with severe dementia. Between his deteriorating mind and her failing health, I suspect the inside of the house is in deplorable condition." "You haven't been out there?" I asked, unable to hide the incredulity in my voice. The farm wasn't more than a 2-hour drive into the country. I couldn't comprehend how they hadn't been out to check on them. My mother's tone instantly flared with defensive guilt. "We have both been working 7 days a week at the shop. We had to let every single one of our mechanics go. Business is dying. We are barely surviving ourselves." I raised my hands in surrender, nodding slowly. I asked what the exact plan was. "I will drive you out there tomorrow morning," my father stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You can stay in the farmhouse until I return to pick you up on Friday. That gives you 6 full days to get their personal lives boxed up and the trash hauled out. I already paid a service to deliver moving boxes. They will drop them off tomorrow afternoon." The following morning, the drive out to the rural county line was smothered in absolute silence. I had spent countless weekends at that farm as a child. The sprawling property always possessed a uniquely creepy, isolated vibration, but to a kid, it was an adventure. I remembered walking through the towering rows of green corn for hours, convinced the fields stretched on infinitely, swallowing the earth. As my father's sedan crunched onto the long, dirt driveway, the nostalgia instantly evaporated. Standing sentry at the very edge of the overgrown cornfield was a massive scarecrow. When did they build that thing? I asked, staring at it through the passenger window. My dad didn't answer. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. He refused to turn his head, merely glancing at the towering figure out of the absolute corner of his eye, his face contorted into a deeply unsettling mask of intense, paralyzing worry. Or perhaps it was profound terror. I couldn't decipher it. As the car rolled slowly past the edge of the field, I kept my eyes locked on the effigy. The harsh autumn wind caught the tattered flannel hanging from its wooden frame. And for a fraction of a second, as the fabric snapped in the breeze, I would have sworn on my own life that the burlap head slowly twisted on its post to watch us drive by. About 20 minutes after my father hastily dropped me off and sped away, leaving a cloud of dry dust in his wake, I was wandering aimlessly through the suffocatingly quiet house. I was mentally cataloging the countless porcelain knickknacks, the faded, dust-covered photographs, trying to process what belonged in a box and what belonged in a garbage bag. Then, the piercing shriek of the landline phone shattered the silence. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. It had been years since I had heard the harsh, mechanical ringing of an old landline. In the oppressive quiet of the dead house, it sounded exactly like a fire alarm. I picked up the heavy, yellowed plastic receiver. "This is the delivery driver," a gruff voice echoed through the static. "I have the flat-packed boxes you ordered, but my GPS is completely dead out here. Just empty fields on the screen. Can you guide me in? Head down the old county highway for about 5 miles, I instructed, peering out the dusty living room window. Make a right at the unmarked dirt road. I paused, racking my brain for a landmark in the endless ocean of dry fields. You'll see a massive scarecrow at the corner of the property. Make a right at the scarecrow. The driver grunted an acknowledgement, and the line clicked dead. Half an hour later, I was standing at the rusted kitchen sink, trying to scrub away a decade of grime. The house was exactly as my mother feared. It was a tomb of neglect. The most disturbing discovery was sitting right on the faded floral tablecloth. My grandmother must have prepared lunch mere moments before she realized my grandfather was missing, because 2 plates of food sat undisturbed on the table. They had been sitting there for weeks. The organic matter had liquefied into a dark, pulsing mass of mold and decay. The pungent, sickeningly sweet stench of rotting meat and spoiled milk coated the back of my throat, making me violently gag. I abandoned the sink and shoved the kitchen window open, gasping for the crisp, untainted autumn air. Outside, a set of rusted metal wind chimes hung from the warped wood of the front porch. The breeze knocked the metal tubes together, producing a hollow, discordant clanking that I somehow found deeply grounding. I closed my eyes, leaning over the sink, breathing in the cold air, wondering how many sweltering summer afternoons my grandparents had sat on that very porch, sipping iced tea, staring out into the endless green. Then, cutting cleanly through the hollow clank of the wind chimes, I heard it. A scream. It erupted from the depths of the cornfield. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the wet porcelain sink. I held my breath, straining my ears against the rushing wind. It happened again. A long, guttural, ragged howl. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded exactly like a human being screaming in unimaginable, agonizing pain. I shoved away from the sink, slammed the front door open, and ran out into the yard. I stopped dead at the edge of the crop. My grandfather had waited far too long to harvest. The blistering late summer sun had entirely bleached the towering stalks. They were no longer green. They were the dull, sickly color of dried bone. The dead husks waved violently back and forth in the wind, the dry, razor-sharp leaves loudly rustling and scraping against each other like a million whispering voices. The guttural howl echoed a third time. "Hello?" I roared into the wall of dead vegetation. "Who is out there?" Silence. Only the ceaseless whispering of the dry stalks. I plunged into the field. I pushed past row after endless row of the bone-white maize, my shoulders scraping against the abrasive leaves. The air inside the crop was stagnant, suffocatingly hot, and smelled of dry earth and rot. I frantically looked left and right down the narrow 8-inch gaps between the claustrophobic rows. Then, 60 yards deep into the maze, I saw a shadow move. A tall, shifting silhouette violently broke through the stalks. I sprinted after it. The ground was uneven, heavily rutted from the tractor tires. I caught fleeting, fragmented glimpses of the figure every few seconds as the swaying corn parted in the wind. I ran faster, my boots crushing the fallen husks, desperation fueling my speed. I had to know who was trespassing on this graveyard. I pushed my legs to their absolute limit, blindly tearing through a thick cluster of stalks, and then I violently collided, full speed, into a solid wall of wood and coarse fabric. The impact was devastating. The dense straw stuffing of the effigy did absolutely nothing to dull the brutal force of the thick wooden crossbeam it was mounted upon. I rebounded off the structure and crashed hard onto my back in the dirt. A sickening crunch echoed in the center of my face. I grabbed my nose, my vision swimming with black spots. My palms were instantaneously flooded with the thick, slick warmth of my own blood. I sat up in the dirt, the world spinning violently. My skull throbbed with a sickening pressure with every single beat of my racing heart. When the dizziness finally subsided enough for me to stand, I wiped the blood from my eyes and looked up. It was the scarecrow. It towered over me. The thick, splintered wooden post was driven deep into the soil. The figure itself was easily 7 feet tall, mounted another 2 feet off the ground. It was dressed in filthy, sun-bleached blue overalls and a rotting red flannel shirt. But it was the face that froze the blood in my veins. The head was a massive, stained burlap sack. A jagged, terrifyingly wide mouth had been violently stitched into the fabric using thick, blood-red twine. 2 massive, hollow black buttons were sewn deeply into the face for eyes. It was topped with a decaying straw hat, grafted directly to the burlap skull with the same hideous red string. Standing at 6'2" myself, I rarely felt dwarfed by anything. But looking up at this towering, grotesquely proportioned mockery of a human being, a primal, icy terror gripped my spine. Those crows must be absolutely paralyzed by this thing, I thought, my breath trembling in my chest. I violently pinched the bridge of my shattered nose to stem the heavy flow of blood, my eyes scanning the surrounding wall of white stalks. This was impossible. I had just seen this exact scarecrow guarding the entrance at the dirt road. There was absolutely no physical way I had run all the way back to the property line. I jumped up, trying to catch a glimpse over the 9-foot canopy of the crop to find the road. Nothing. Just an endless, shifting ocean of bone-colored corn stretching endlessly toward the flat horizon. When my boots hit the dirt again, the violent jarring made my skull feel as if it were going to physically detonate. A thick, dark stream of blood surged down my throat and over my lips. I clamped my fingers tighter over my nostrils and tilted my head back, staring up at the gray, overcast sky, praying for the bleeding to clot. That is when the movement caught the absolute periphery of my vision. I slowly lowered my chin. The scarecrow was no longer staring blankly across the field. Its oversized burlap head was now angled sharply downward. Staring directly down at me, I froze. My lungs locked completely. I desperately tried to rationalize the impossible geometry. I told myself I was concussed. I told myself I was being deeply, pathetically ridiculous. The wind was fierce. The wind had simply rotated the heavy sack of straw. The wind was violently thrashing the stalks, creating the auditory illusion of howling. The shadows playing tricks in the rows had created the illusion of a running man. I stared into the black, unreflective voids of the oversized button eyes, and as I stood there in the deafening rustle of the dead corn, I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that it was staring right back into my soul. The hair on my forearms stood rigid. A cold, electric tingling swept violently across my skin. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, desperate to escape. Then, with a sickening, violent, utterly mechanical jerk, the scarecrow abruptly snapped its burlap head back up, locking its gaze back out over the endless horizon. I didn't think. I ran. I spun on my heel and bolted in the exact opposite direction. I tore blindly through the dense vegetation, stealing frantic, terrified glances over my shoulder. All I could see was the chaotic, crushed path of broken white stalks left in my wake. My lungs burned with the sheer, agonizing effort. My broken nose made it impossible to breathe deeply. Ahead of me, cutting through the rustling stalks, I heard the deep, rumbling grind of a heavy diesel engine. A truck, I hurled my body forward, ignoring the razor-sharp leaves violently slashing at my face and arms. My boot caught hard on the edge of a hidden, shallow irrigation trench. I was launched completely airborne, violently tumbling out of the suffocating wall of corn and crashing down onto the hard-packed gravel of the driveway. The heavy tires of the delivery box truck locked up instantly. The massive vehicle skidded across the dirt, stopping mere inches from crushing my skull. I lay there in the swirling dust, gasping for air, choking on my own blood. The heavy metal door of the cab swung violently open. The driver vaulted out, his boots hitting the gravel with a heavy crunch. "What the absolute hell is wrong with you?" he roared, his voice laced with aggressive, unapologetic hostility. I staggered to my feet, my chest heaving. He was a massive man, early 40s, with a thick, tangled beard and an imposing frame. I am so sorry," I gasped, spitting a mouthful of metallic blood into the dust. I lost my footing. I couldn't stop myself from whipping my head back toward the impenetrable wall of white corn, fully expecting the towering, burlap-faced monster to come violently tearing out of the stalks to finish me. The driver followed my frantic gaze into the empty, rustling field, then slowly turned his hard eyes back to me. "Are you high, boy?" he demanded, his tone dropping into a deadly serious register. I was. I choked on the words, immediately silencing myself. Telling this aggressive stranger that I was being hunted through the maze by an animated, murderous scarecrow would only validate his accusation. "I took a bad fall," I lied, pressing my trembling, blood-soaked hand back against my ruined nose. "Hit my face pretty hard on a rock." He stared at me for a long, judgmental moment, then finally gave a slow, reluctant nod. He gestured toward the cab, offering to drive me the remaining quarter-mile up to the porch. "I would have been up here 20 minutes ago if you actually knew how to give proper directions," he muttered angrily as he threw the truck into gear. There wasn't any damn scarecrow down by the road. A fresh wave of icy dread washed over my chest. I stared blankly out the dirty windshield as we crept up the driveway. We parked in front of the rotting porch and began silently unloading the stacks of flattened cardboard from the back of his rig. "I'll be back on Friday afternoon to load these up once you have them packed," the driver grunted, tossing the last bundle onto the warped wooden deck. "Your father rented a storage unit on the far side of town. You only have a 10 by 20 space, so keep that in mind before you start throwing every piece of junk into a box." He paused, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a grease-stained rag, and stared out into the endless, bleached ocean of the unharvested field. "My old man owns a massive spread in the next county over," he said, his voice entirely devoid of its previous anger, replaced now by a quiet, calculating curiosity. "His yield didn't do half as well as whatever the hell they grew here. Actually, now that I think about it, I drove my rig past this exact property last autumn. I remember they had a completely dead crop. Dried up to nothing. Do you have any earthly idea what your grandfather did differently this season?" "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, I don't." The driver nodded slowly, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Well, take care of that face. I'll see you on Friday." He climbed back into the massive cab and the truck rumbled away, leaving me entirely alone in the suffocating silence. I fled inside the house. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me, engaging the deadbolt with a loud, metallic snap. I staggered into the downstairs bathroom, turning the rusted faucet handles. I furiously washed the drying, sticky blood from my hands and face, watching the water turn a deep, rusty red before spiraling down the drain. I stripped off my ruined shirt and pulled a clean one from my duffel bag. I desperately tried to rationalize the horrific impossibility of the field. I was stressed. I was grieving the horrific, violent loss of my grandparents. The claustrophobia of the flight, the nicotine withdrawal, the brutal impact to my skull. My brain was fractured. It was a trauma-induced hallucination. Nothing more. I forced myself to begin the agonizing work. I needed a distraction to keep my mind from fracturing completely. I carried a stack of boxes into my grandfather's dusty, wood-paneled office. I began indiscriminately shoving stacks of yellowed tax documents and faded receipts into a black garbage bag. Near the bottom of the drawer, beneath a heavy ledger, I found a sealed envelope. It was addressed to my father, written in my grandmother's trembling, uneven cursive. I tore the paper open. "Son, I need immediate help. The dementia is accelerating. Over the last 2 days, he has been pacing the house, raving like an absolute lunatic. Early this spring, a stranger drove up to the house and offered us a scarecrow. He claimed it was a gift. He promised it did absolute wonders for his own land and simply wanted to pay the blessing forward. Your father tried to send the man away, convinced he was a swindler trying to bleed us, but the man was relentless. He swore he wanted absolutely zero money in return. Now, the crop is massive, unnatural, but your father is entirely convinced that the scarecrow is the sole reason we survived the drought. Worse, he refuses to touch the tractor. He is terrified. He sits by the window all night, staring into the dark, screaming that the scarecrow will not allow him to harvest the corn. I have left you 4 voicemails regarding this, and you simply refuse to call me back. I am terrified. Please come out here. I am so deeply worried about what he might do. Mom, the paper slipped from my trembling fingers, fluttering silently to the faded carpet. I collapsed backward into the heavy leather desk chair. I could desperately attempt to dismiss my own terrifying encounter as stress, a hallucination born from a violent concussion. But my grandfather suffering from the exact same paralyzing delusion regarding the exact same monstrous effigy? What were the mathematical odds of that shared psychosis? The walls of the office felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. The air was too thin. I needed a cigarette. Now, I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped out onto the rotting wooden planks of the porch. I pulled the pack from my pocket, placed a cylinder between my lips, and struck the vintage lighter. I took a massive, agonizingly deep drag, feeling the harsh smoke scorch my throat. I exhaled a thick gray cloud into the crisp air. A sudden freezing gust of wind violently swept across the yard, bringing the rusted metal wind chimes to life with a chaotic, aggressive clatter. I slowly turned around to look at the hanging tubes, a fleeting, mundane thought crossing my mind about whether they were worth packing into a box. When I turned my head back toward the field, my heart stopped completely. The scarecrow was no longer hidden deep within the maze of stalks. It was standing exactly 20 feet away from the porch. It hung motionless on its thick wooden cross, the grotesque, jagged red mouth grinning at me. The black button eyes locked onto mine, my mind entirely shattered. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't blink. As I stood there, utterly paralyzed by the impossible horror standing in the yard, the scarecrow moved. It didn't climb down. It violently dropped from the post, its burlap boots hitting the dirt with a heavy, sickening thud. The instant it disconnected, the heavy 10-foot wooden post it had been mounted upon shot violently straight up into the air, hovering for a fraction of a second, before being viciously yanked backward, disappearing completely into the impenetrable wall of white corn. This cannot be happening. It cannot be alive. The frantic, terrified mantra repeated endlessly in my mind. 2 seconds later, the scarecrow violently erupted from the edge of the crop. It did not run like a man. Its movements were chaotic, jerky, propelled by an impossible supernatural momentum. It was charging directly across the dead lawn, moving with terrifying speed. In its massive, burlap-wrapped hands, it carried the 10-foot wooden mounting post, holding it horizontally over its shoulder like a Spartan soldier charging with a massive, lethal spear. It closed the distance in seconds. The scarecrow violently twisted its torso and launched the massive beam. The heavy timber sailed through the air like a missile. It missed my skull by less than 12 inches. The sheer force of the throw ripped the metal wind chimes completely off the roof before the post violently impaled the thick exterior wall of the farmhouse directly behind me, burying itself 2 feet deep into the wood and drywall with a deafening structural crack. The impact violently shattered the window. Shards of glass rained down onto the porch. I spun around to dive back through the front door, but the massive, splintered wooden beam was violently wedged across the frame, completely barricading the entrance. I hurled myself over the wooden railing of the porch, hitting the dirt hard, and sprinted frantically toward the decaying, massive red structure of the old barn. I could hear the monster directly behind me. The heavy, unnatural thud of its boots. The deafening, dry rustle of the thick straw shifting beneath its rotting overalls. It was gaining on me rapidly. I dove through the wide entrance of the barn. I grabbed the heavy wooden sliding door and violently heaved with everything I had, desperately trying to pull it shut. The rusted iron track was completely seized from years of absolute neglect. It wouldn't budge an inch. I backed away into the shadows. I frantically scanned the dark, dust-filled room for anything I could use to defend myself. My hands closed around the smooth, worn ash handle of an old, rusted iron pitchfork leaning against a stall. The scarecrow slowly stepped through the open doorway. The dim light of the barn caught the blood-red stitching of its jagged mouth. The massive black button eyes drank the shadows. Stripped of the blinding daylight, it looked infinitely more menacing as it began a slow, deliberate, mechanical march toward me. I planted my feet, raised the weapon, and violently rammed the heavy iron tines of the pitchfork directly into the center of its chest with every ounce of adrenaline in my body. The rusted metal violently pierced the rotting flannel, sinking deep into its torso with absolutely no resistance. It had absolutely zero effect. The creature didn't even break its stride. It reached out. Its left hand, a crude, thick mitten fashioned from rough burlap, violently clamped around my forearm. The grip was like an industrial steel vise. The bone in my arm felt like it was going to snap under the impossible, crushing pressure. With its right hand, it casually grasped the wooden shaft of the pitchfork. With a single, effortless jerk, it violently ripped the iron tines out of its own chest, twisting the weapon around, pointing the rusted metal spikes directly at my throat. I thrashed violently against its grip, screaming in pure, primal terror. My kicks connected with a body that felt like solid, unyielding concrete wrapped in dry straw. It was utterly useless. It slowly raised the pitchfork. My free hand frantically tore through the pockets of my jacket. My trembling fingers found the heavy, cold brass. I ripped the vintage lighter from my pocket. I violently flicked the lid open with my thumb and struck the flint. The spark caught instantly. A bright, burning yellow flame erupted in the dim shadows of the barn. I thrust my hand forward, burying the burning flame directly against the frayed, dry burlap hanging from its jaw. The ignition was instantaneous and explosive. The decades-old, bone-dry straw stuffing inside the creature violently caught fire. Within 3 seconds, the entire upper half of the scarecrow was entirely engulfed in a raging, blinding inferno. It instantly released my arm. It didn't scream. It didn't make a single auditory sound. It just spun around, a towering pillar of violent flame, and fled out of the barn, sprinting blindly back out toward the fields. The fire relentlessly consumed the unharvested crop. The entire ocean of dead white corn burned to ash in less than an hour, the flames reaching 50 feet into the overcast sky. The county fire department eventually arrived, spraying the blackened earth. The fire chief quickly determined that the massive blaze was completely accidental, blaming the overly dry, unharvested stalks in a stray ember. They had absolutely zero interest in investigating the matter any further than filling out the basic insurance paperwork. When my father finally returned on Friday afternoon to pick me up, the property was a blackened, smoking crater. He parked the sedan. He didn't look at the miles of scorched earth. He walked directly up to the porch. He stood in silence, staring intently at the massive, 10-foot wooden mounting post still violently impaled deep into the exterior wall of his childhood home. I knew, instantly, that he recognized the timber. He knew exactly what had been mounted on it. He didn't ask a single question about how the heavy beam had been violently thrown through the siding. He didn't ask a single question about how the massive, sprawling field had burned completely to the ground. I know, buried deep down on some repressed, terrified level, he fully suspects that the monstrous thing that stood in that field violently murdered his parents. I know, on some unspoken level, that he is profoundly, deeply grateful that I burned it alive. But I know we will never, ever discuss it, because if we ever spoke the truth out loud, the world would lock us away. We keep the silence. I was sitting on the cold, grooved plastic of the subway seat. The car was mostly empty, carrying nothing but the hollow echoes of our transit. Just my mother and me, suspended in the belly of the city. The rhythmic, deafening clack of the steel wheels against the tracks usually lulled me into a quiet trance. But not that night. The air inside the carriage felt entirely too heavy, pressing down on my chest. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a sickly, stuttering yellow hum, making the shadows bleed and stretch across the sticky floor. We were heading home. It was impossibly late. The kind of late where the world feels completely abandoned, hollowed out, leaving only the ghosts behind to ride the transit lines. My mother was exhausted. I could see the profound weariness in the heavy slump of her shoulders, the way she kept her tired eyes fixed on the black, smudged window opposite us. She was just watching our pale, ghost-like reflections rattle along in the dark glass. Neither of us spoke. There was no need to. The silence between us was a comfortable blanket against the harsh, mechanical screaming of the train. Then, the train began to slow. The brakes shrieked, a high, agonizing wail of metal tearing against metal. The carriage lurched, swaying violently before grinding to a halt at a station I did not recognize. The doors slid open with a heavy, pneumatic hiss. The platform outside was entirely swallowed in shadows. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The open doors just gaped like a wound. Then, a shape stepped out from the darkness. It was a man. He moved with a slow, uneven drag, his boots scraping heavily against the scuffed floor of the train car. The doors hissed shut behind him, sealing us in. The train lurched forward once more, plunging us back into the suffocating tunnel. I didn't want to look at him. Every primitive instinct buried deep in my brain screamed at me to keep my eyes down, to become invisible, to blend into the cracked plastic seat. But my eyes betrayed me. They drifted upward, drawn by the undeniable gravitational pull of something profoundly wrong. He was tall, wearing a heavy, dark coat that looked far too thick for the season. It swallowed his frame, making his shoulders look hunched and unnatural. A wide-brimmed hat sat low on his head, casting a deep, impenetrable shadow over the upper half of his face. His skin, what little I could see of it, was the color of old parchment. Ashy. Dead. In his right hand, gripped with a white-knuckled intensity, he held a crumpled brown paper bag. The bottom of the bag was stained with dark, spreading grease spots. He did not sit down. Even though the carriage was completely empty, save for my mother and me, he chose to stand. And he chose to stand directly in front of us. He reached up, wrapping a long, pale, spider-like hand around the overhead railing. And then, he looked at me. Even beneath the heavy shadow of his hat, I could feel the terrible weight of his stare. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was a physical force. A heavy, suffocating pressure pushing down on my throat. His eyes, they were entirely too wide. The whites were visible all the way around the dark, pinpoint pupils. Unblinking, unmoving, piercing straight through my skin, digging into the hollow spaces of my bones. My breath caught in my throat. The silence in the car suddenly felt deafening. The clacking of the train faded into a distant, muffled heartbeat. I shifted uncomfortably, my skin crawling under his relentless gaze. I tried to pull myself closer to my mother, seeking the safety of her warmth. I desperately needed a distraction. I needed to break the invisible tether, connecting his unblinking eyes to mine. I gently nudged my mother's arm, my fingers trembling slightly. I silently motioned toward her purse. She understood. Without looking up at the man, keeping her eyes carefully, deliberately fixed on her lap, she reached into her bag and handed me her glowing cell phone. I took it with shaking hands. I jammed the little white earbuds into my ears and turned the screen on. I opened a video, staring blankly at the moving colors, turning the volume up until the digital noise drowned out the rhythmic screaming of the train. I tried to lose myself in the screen. I tried to pretend the carriage was empty. I tried to pretend I couldn't feel the icy, prickling sensation spreading across the back of my neck, but I could see him in my peripheral vision. The dark shape of his coat, the pale grip of his hand on the railing, the greasy paper bag swaying slightly with the motion of the train. He hadn't moved an inch. He was still staring. Minutes stretched into hours. The train swallowed mile after mile of black tunnel. The tension in the air was so thick, so dense, it felt like I was drowning in it. Then, the digital noise in my ears was shattered. The man spoke. His voice didn't come from the air around us. It felt like it crawled directly inside my head. It was a dry, rasping sound, like dry leaves dragging across concrete. She looks a lot like my daughter. The words hung in the stale air, heavy and rotting. I froze. The video on the screen blurred into meaningless light. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, carefully, my mother shifted beside me. I could feel the sudden, rigid tension in her muscles. She finally looked up, offering a tight, forced, extremely polite smile. The kind of smile you use to placate a rabid dog. "Oh," she said, her voice trembling slightly beneath the surface. "Thank you." She immediately looked back down, clutching her purse tighter. A clear, universal signal. Conversation over. Do not engage. But the man didn't care about signals. He wasn't participating in a normal human interaction. He was operating on a completely different, terrifying frequency. My daughter is pretty too, he continued, the dry rasp of his voice unchanged, unwavering. She seems to be about the exact same age as your daughter. The silence returned, heavier this time, a suffocating blanket of dread. My mother did not reply. She just stared at her hands, her knuckles turning white. You must be having a very hard time, the man whispered, leaning forward ever so slightly. The shadow of his hat shifted. I saw his mouth. It was stretched into a thin, unnatural, completely mirthless line. Taking the subway so incredibly late at night, my mother's breathing became shallow. I could feel the heat radiating from her panic. She pulled me just a fraction closer, her arm acting as a fragile barrier between me and the looming darkness of his coat. Then, the man moved. He let go of the overhead railing. His hand, pale and trembling slightly, reached down and grabbed the crumpled brown paper bag he had been clutching. He thrust it forward, right into my face. The sudden movement made me flinch violently. The bag was so close I could smell the grease. It smelled heavy, yeasty, sickly sweet, and fundamentally wrong. I baked some bread today, he rasped, his voice suddenly vibrating with a strange, dark intensity. Give it to your daughter. I stared at the bag. The grease stains looked like dark, spreading eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mother reacted instantly. She held up her hand, a physical shield, shaking her head with frantic, forced politeness. Oh no, thank you, she stammered, her voice high and tight. That's very kind of you. But we couldn't possibly. She just ate. We're perfectly fine. Really. She tried to push the bag away, her fingers brushing against the coarse brown paper. The man did not retract his arm. He held the bag suspended in the air between us, completely immovable. Like a statue. You know, he whispered, his unblinking eyes burning into mine from the shadows of his hat. Lots of children are usually incredibly hungry at this time of night. The train car felt perfectly silent. The mechanical clacking had vanished, replaced entirely by the sound of my own frantic pulse. Take it, he commanded. The thin smile was completely gone. His face was a stiff, horrifying mask. This is a really delicious one. My mother was trembling now. A full, visible shake. She looked desperately toward the dark windows, silently praying for the next station to appear out of the blackness. But there was only the endless tunnel. There was nowhere to run. We were trapped in a metal box moving at 50 miles an hour beneath the earth, completely at the mercy of this looming, whispering shadow. The man pushed the bag an inch closer. It brushed against my knee. Take it. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a threat. The air in the carriage grew freezing cold. The flickering lights overhead seemed to dim, casting deeper, darker shadows across his parchment skin. My mother surrendered. The survival instinct kicked in. Appease the threat. Do whatever it takes to survive the next 5 minutes. With a shaking, hesitant hand, I reached out. My fingers touched the coarse paper. The bag felt strangely warm. Unnaturally warm. A heavy, damp heat that made my stomach churn violently. I took the bag. I placed it on my lap. I didn't dare open it. I just let it sit there, a heavy, greasy weight pressing down on my legs. The man finally leaned back. He grabbed the overhead railing again. But he did not look away. He remained entirely focused on me, watching the bag, watching my hands. The silence stretched on, thin and brittle, ready to shatter at any second. We waited. We waited for salvation. We waited for the screeching of the brakes. We waited for the doors to open. Time lost all meaning. There was only the hum of the lights, the heavy, damp warmth of the bag on my lap, and the unblinking stare of the shadow man. Then he spoke again. Why aren't you eating? The words dropped like heavy stones onto a glass floor. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, praying for invisibility, praying to wake up. I looked up at him. His face was completely blank. A void of emotion. I stammered, my voice cracking, sounding impossibly small in the echoing carriage. I didn't know what to do. I just ate a lot before we got on the train. So, I'm really not hungry right now. I will eat it later. I promise. I tried to smile. I tried to project innocence. The man did not smile back. He leaned down, until his face was mere inches from mine. The shadow of his hat fell completely over my eyes. I could smell him now. That sour, rotting earth smell mixed with the sickly sweet yeast of the bag. Suddenly, his eyes bulged. The wide, white orbs seemed to strain against their sockets. The thin, tight skin around his face pulled back, revealing a jagged, horrifying grimace. I said, he hissed, a guttural, wet sound exploding from his throat. Why aren't you eating? His voice echoed, vibrating against the plastic walls of the carriage. I stopped breathing. My heart stopped beating. The terror paralyzed me completely. I couldn't move my hands. I couldn't turn my head. I was entirely pinned down by the sheer, unadulterated madness radiating from his wide, staring eyes. I remember the profound stiffness of his face. It was completely rigid, like a wax mask melting over a skull. I will never forget that face. I will never forget the absolute void behind his eyes. I forced myself to speak. My lips felt numb. My throat was filled with sand. I'm sorry, I whispered, the words barely escaping my mouth. I tried to angle my body away, clutching the greasy bag to my chest like a shield. Why do you want me to eat this bread instead of giving it to your daughter? The question hung in the air. A desperate, terrifying gamble. The man stopped. The bulging of his eyes slowly receded. The terrifying, jagged grimace melted away, returning to that stiff, unreadable blankness. He slowly straightened his back, looming over us once more. Oh, he said, his voice dropping back into that dry, dragging whisper, because I can't see my daughter anymore. The implication of those words slammed into me like a physical blow. A profound, icy dread washed over my entire body. The warm, damp bag on my lap suddenly felt like it was burning through my clothes. My mother didn't hesitate anymore. The paralyzing fear had shattered, replaced by pure, desperate maternal instinct. She stood up. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at the man. She just reached down, her fingers digging painfully into my shoulder, and hauled me to my feet. She dragged me down the aisle. We practically ran to the doors at the far end of the carriage. The brakes began to shriek. The train was slowing down. The next station was finally approaching. We stood directly in front of the metal doors, our bodies pressed tightly together. My mother kept her back completely rigid, shielding me. But I couldn't stop myself. The invisible tether was still there. I slowly turned my head, peering past my mother's arm. The man was still standing there, in the exact same spot. Under the flickering yellow light, he had turned his head. He was watching us walk away. He was watching us wait. For the 10 longest minutes of my entire life, as the train slowly ground its way toward the platform, he just stood there, staring, the dead, unblinking eyes burning a hole through the back of my skull. The station lights finally flared through the windows. The train jerked to a complete stop. The doors hissed open. Before we could even take a single step onto the safety of the bright platform, the heavy boots scraped against the floor. He was right behind us. He leaned in, his face mere inches from the back of my neck. I could feel the cold, sour puff of his breath against my skin. I gave you this, he spat, his voice trembling with a sudden, violent rage. Why didn't you eat it? Why? Why? He began to shout, the sound tearing through the silent station. My mother shoved me forward. We broke into a dead sprint. We didn't look back. We didn't scream. We just ran. Our feet slapped frantically against the concrete tiles of the station, echoing into the cavernous ceiling. We bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, desperate to reach the cold, fresh air of the surface. We ran as if the darkness itself was reaching out to drag us back down. We burst out of the subway entrance and into the empty, quiet street. We kept running, down the sidewalk, past the glowing streetlights, turning down a narrow, shadowed alleyway to cut the distance to our apartment. We finally stopped, gasping for air, our lungs burning. The silence of the night enveloped us. We were alone. I looked down. I was still holding the bag. My fingers were clamped around the greasy brown paper in a death grip. My mother saw it. Her eyes widened with absolute horror. "Throw it away," she gasped, her voice ragged and breathless. "Throw it away right now." I didn't need to be told twice. I wanted this thing off of me. I wanted the heavy, damp warmth gone. A few feet away, a metal garbage can sat in the shadows of the alley. I walked over to it. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold onto the paper. For a fleeting, terrifying second, my mind played a trick on me. I thought about opening it. I thought about looking inside. The man's bizarre favor, the intense, unyielding demand, the sick curiosity whispered in the back of my head, but the memory of his wide, dead eyes flashed in the darkness. The memory of his voice? I can't see my daughter anymore. A wave of pure nausea hit me. I lifted my arm and forcefully slammed the heavy, greasy bag into the garbage can. I turned away instantly. I grabbed my mother's hand and we walked the rest of the way home in total, suffocating silence. We locked the doors. We checked the windows. We never spoke of the shadow man again, but I can never unsee it. I still think about that heavy, warm paper bag. I think about the dark grease stains bleeding through the bottom. I think about what was really hiding inside that coarse brown paper, because the next morning, when the sun finally broke through the clouds, the neighborhood was completely silent, except for the distant wailing of an ambulance siren. Someone had found something in the alleyway, right next to the garbage can. A man, a homeless man who usually slept near the subway vents. He was lying on the cold concrete, dead. His body was contorted, his hands clawing desperately at his own throat. His face was frozen in a rigid, horrifying mask of absolute agony, and lying in the dirt, mere inches from his stiff, outstretched fingertips, was a half-eaten piece of bread. We booked the room for a weekend. A quiet escape. The lobby was a sprawling cavern of polished marble and low, ambient lighting, designed to soothe, to lull you into a false sense of security. There were so many doors, so many identical corridors stretching into vanishing points, and an army of staff moving like ghosts to keep the illusion perfect. You are not supposed to notice the people who empty the bins, carry the towels, or push the heavy carts down the endless halls. They are meant to be background noise. Invisible, but from the first evening, the background began to bleed into the foreground. It started in the dining hall. The room was loud, filled with the clinking of silverware, the murmur of 100 overlapping conversations, and the soft jazz piped in through hidden speakers. I was sitting across from my partner, listening to the day's recap, nodding along, but the back of my neck began to prickle. It was that ancient biological alarm that tells you you are being hunted. I slowly turned my head, scanning the room. He was standing by the service doors, a man in the hotel's standard uniform, perfectly still. While the other workers moved with frantic purpose, carrying trays and clearing tables, he was entirely motionless. His hands hung limply at his sides, and he was staring directly at me. There was no expression on his face, no polite service industry smile, just a blank, dead-eyed gaze that cut through the crowded room and locked onto mine. I held it for a second, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach, before forcing myself to look away. When I dared to glance back a minute later, he was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Just a tired employee zoning out, but a hotel of that size operates on a massive shift rotation. You rarely see the same face twice. The mathematics of probability dictated that I shouldn't have seen him again. The next afternoon, the air in the indoor pool area was thick, suffocatingly humid, and heavy with the chemical sting of chlorine. We had the water mostly to ourselves. The sound of rippling water echoed sharply off the tiled walls, amplifying the emptiness of the space. I pulled myself out of the shallow end, reaching for a towel. The glass doors leading to the gym were frosted, except for a small, clear pane in the center. Standing on the other side of the glass, perfectly framed in that small square, was the same man. He wasn't cleaning. He wasn't walking past. He was simply standing there, on the other side of the door, watching me drip onto the tiles. The stillness of his posture was unnatural. It was the stillness of a predator waiting in the brush. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy. broken only by the rhythmic lapping of the pool water. I didn't point him out to my partner. I didn't want to break the fragile piece of the trip. I just wrapped the towel tighter around myself, turned my back, and waited for the feeling of being watched to pass. It didn't. By our final night, the unease had settled deep in my bones. The sprawling luxury of the hotel no longer felt accommodating. It felt like a labyrinth. Every identical door, every twisting hallway, felt like a trap. Around midnight, the ice bucket in our room was empty. I needed to get out of the room for just a moment, to walk off the restless energy that had been gnawing at me all day. I picked up the plastic bucket and stepped out into the corridor. At night, the hotel changed. The ambient music was turned off. The lighting was dimmed. The long hallway stretched infinitely in both directions, completely deserted. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps, creating a deadened, vacuum-like silence. I walked toward the alcove, where the vending and ice machines were hidden, the soft mechanical hum growing louder with each step. I stepped into the alcove. The machine roared to life as I pressed the bucket against the lever, dispensing the crushed ice with a loud, aggressive rattling. The noise was deafening in the quiet of the night. As the bucket filled, the hair on my arms stood on end. The air in the small alcove seemed to drop in temperature. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear a door open or close. But I knew I wasn't alone. I stopped the machine. The rattling ceased, plunging the space back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I slowly turned around. He was standing at the edge of the alcove, blocking the exit to the hallway. The same uniform. The same blank, unblinking stare. He was standing too close. The proximity violated every unspoken rule of human interaction. The silence was absolute. I could hear my own pulse drumming in my ears. Instinct told me to run, but logic desperately tried to maintain control. I tried to defuse the tension. I tried to pretend this was normal. I forced the corners of my mouth up into a weak, trembling smile. I nodded, holding the bucket of ice tightly against my chest like a shield. "Evening," I whispered. He didn't blink. He didn't nod back. The blankness in his eyes shifted, darkening into something fiercely, intensely hostile. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I took a hesitant step forward, intending to slip past him. As I moved, I gave a small, awkward half-wave. Well, by then, the reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. His jaw clamped shut. In the absolute quiet of the alcove, I heard the distinct, sickening sound of bone grinding against bone. He was grinding his teeth together so hard the muscles in his jaw trembled. His hands, still hanging at his sides, curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. I didn't wait. I lowered my head, pressed my shoulder forward, and practically pushed past him, brushing against the rough fabric of his uniform. He didn't move to stop me, but he didn't step back either. Once I was in the hallway, I didn't look back. I walked fast. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The hallway felt twice as long as before, the identical doors blurring past as I practically jogged back to our room. I swiped the keycard. The little green light flashed. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I threw the deadbolt. Click. I reached up and slid the heavy metal security chain into its groove. Click. I stood with my back against the door, breathing hard, staring into the dark room. My partner stirred in the bed, murmuring sleepily, completely unaware of the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Everything okay?" a groggy voice asked from the dark. "Yeah," I lied, my voice tight. "Just took a minute. I didn't say anything." I couldn't. How do you explain that a look made you feel hunted? How do you articulate the dread of a silent man grinding his teeth? I told myself I was being paranoid. The door was locked. The deadbolt was thrown. The chain was secured. Nobody could get in without a key, and even then, the chain would hold. We were safe. Tomorrow we would check out, drive home, and I would never see him again. I climbed into bed. The room was pitch black, save for the faint red numbers glowing on the digital alarm clock. I lay on my back, staring up at the invisible ceiling. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I drifted off, I saw his dead eyes. I heard the sickening grind of his teeth. The hours crawled by. The silence of the room was oppressive. The red numbers on the clock shifted slowly. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. The hotel was dead. Not a single sound leaked through the heavy walls. The world had shrunk down to the four corners of our room. Then, the silence broke. It was faint at first. A metallic scrape. I stopped breathing. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears in the dark. There it was again. Clack. It was coming from the door. I slowly turned my head on the pillow. The door was just a dark rectangle in the shadows across the room. Jiggle. The heavy brass doorknob was moving. It wasn't a bump. It wasn't someone accidentally brushing against it as they walked down the hall. It was deliberate. Someone was wrapping their hand around the knob and slowly, carefully turning it. My partner shot up in bed next to me, the movement sudden and sharp. The air was sucked out of the room. We sat there in the dark, frozen, listening. Jiggle. Twist. The knob hit the lock and sprang back. Someone's at the door, my partner whispered, panic bleeding into the hushed voice. I swallowed the lump of terror in my throat. Logic. I needed logic. It's fine, I whispered back, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. It's a huge hotel. Someone just got the wrong floor. They think it's their room. It happens all the time. We waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The doorknob stopped moving. The hallway was silent again. I let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the tension slowly start to drain from my shoulders. It was a mistake. Just a drunk guest at the wrong door. Then came the sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Beep. The sharp, electronic chirp of the keycard scanner, followed immediately by the heavy, mechanical thud of the deadbolt retracting. Someone had a key. The blood turned to ice in my veins. The heavy wooden door began to move. It swung inward, the hinges silent, revealing a tall, vertical slice of the dimly lit hallway. The darkness of the hallway pushed into the room. The door kept opening until it reached the limit of the security chain. The metal links pulled taut with a vicious, violent snap. The door jerked to a sudden halt, caught by the steel chain. Through the narrow 2-inch gap between the door and the frame, I saw a shadow standing in the hallway. Just a sliver of darkness, utterly still. The air from the corridor drifted in, cold and stale. There were no words, no demands, no explanations. The shadow didn't try to force the door. It didn't reach a hand through the gap. The realization of the chain seemed to hang in the air between us. Then, as swiftly and silently as it had opened, the door was pulled shut. Click. The latch caught. The deadbolt slid back into place. The room was plunged back into the suffocating quiet. I didn't think. Instinct took over completely. I threw the blankets off, my bare feet hitting the cold carpet. I crossed the room in 3 massive strides, practically slamming my face against the heavy wood of the door. I pressed my eye to the small glass peephole. The distorted fisheye lens revealed the empty hallway. But at the very edge of the frame, walking briskly away, fading into the shadows of the long corridor, was a figure. I only saw the back of them, the familiar cut of the uniform, the stiff, unnatural posture. The dead, silent gait. He didn't look back. He simply rounded the corner and disappeared. I stood at the door for a long time, my eye pressed to the glass, waiting for him to come back. The cold metal of the peephole pressed against my skin. My hand gripped the door handle, holding it shut with all my strength, terrified that the electronic beep would sound again. Behind me, my partner was shaking, begging me to come back to the bed, begging me to stay away from the door. I wanted to run out there. I wanted to scream down the hallway. I wanted to run down to the lobby and demand answers, demand the police, demand anything. But the thought of opening that door, the thought of undoing that chain, and stepping out into that endless, empty, silent hallway, I couldn't do it. If I opened the door, he might be waiting just out of sight. So I stayed. I sat on the floor with my back against the heavy wood, my knees pulled to my chest, watching the red numbers on the clock drag us toward morning. Every creak of the building, every groan of the pipes, sounded like a footstep. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the terrible knowledge of what was waiting just on the other side of the wall. When the sun finally began to bleed through the edges of the curtains, painting the room in a dull gray light, we packed our bags in absolute silence. We didn't shower. We didn't change. We just threw our things together, unlatched the chain with shaking hands, and practically ran down the corridor. The lobby was bright. The morning staff was cheerful. They served coffee and smiled brightly behind the counter. The contrast was sickening. I approached the front desk, my voice hoarse, my hands trembling as I dropped the keycards on the marble counter. I told them what happened. I told them someone with a master key tried to enter our room at 3 a.m. I told them about the worker, the stare, the teeth. The receptionist listened with a sympathetic, professionally concerned nod. They typed something into the computer. They apologized for the inconvenience. They assured me that security would look into the log of the keycard readers. It was the polite, practiced deflection of a corporation protecting itself. They didn't care. They didn't understand the sheer terror of that chain snapping taut in the dark. We walked out into the bright morning sun, the heavy glass doors of the hotel sliding shut behind us. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't scan the windows. I just got into the car and drove. The hotel was pristine. The sheets were clean. The amenities were perfect. But luxury is just a facade. It's a mask draped over a sprawling, empty maze. You pay for the quiet, but you never really know what the quiet is hiding. You lock your door, you throw the deadbolt, and you tell yourself you are safe. But sometimes, the monster isn't breaking in from the outside. Sometimes, the monster already has the key. I used to invite the darkness in. I would stand in empty, cold rooms and silently demand that something, anything, show itself. I was a skeptic. Worse than a skeptic. I was arrogant. I believed that the shadows were just absences of light. I believed the creaks of settling wood were just architecture bowing to time. I used to say out loud that I wanted to experience the impossible, just so I could claim I had faced it. I wanted a ghost story. I wanted the thrill. Until December 30th, 2006. A date permanently burned into the architecture of my mind. I was visiting an old friend in the city for the new year. He lived in an ancient, towering house that felt too heavy for its foundation. It was filled with drafts and dark corners. I was staying on the second floor, taking the room of a tenant who had gone away for the holidays. My friend slept on the ground floor. Another tenant lived down in the basement, a subterranean space that felt completely detached from the rest of the world. When I arrived, they told me the stories. They spoke in hushed, nervous tones about the house. They said it held things. They said one room in particular had never kept an occupant for more than 6 months. People would move in, experience something deeply wrong, and break their lease immediately. The current tenant of that room was away, but he had left behind a warning. He was a skeptic too, until he woke up in the dead of night. He felt the heavy winter covers being slowly, deliberately, pulled off his body. When his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw a face. A woman's face. Pale, transparent, floating mere inches from his own. Just staring. He slowly reached for his phone to take a picture, but she dissolved into the dark. He stayed, but the skepticism was gone. I laughed it off. I remember smiling. I wanted it to happen to me. I wanted to see her. Be careful what you ask for in the dark. It was the night before New Year's Eve. We had exhausted ourselves the previous evening, so we decided to stay in. No alcohol, no altered states. We were completely sober. By 1 a.m, the house was dead quiet. Everyone retreated to their rooms. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, the old wooden steps groaning under my weight. That is an important detail. The house was a chorus of creaking hardwood. You could not shift your weight without the floorboards announcing your presence. I have sharp hearing. I could track anyone's movements through the house just by listening to the distinct groans of the timber. I lay in bed. The room was unfamiliar, smelling of old dust and cold winter air. It was deep into the night. I was staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to pull me under. Then, the silence broke. It started at the back of the house. Downstairs. By the kitchen, a doorknob rattled. It wasn't a gentle jiggle. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. I lay there, my eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the doorway of my room. My first thought was rational. It had to be my friend, or the tenant from the basement, messing with me. But then, I realized what was missing. There had been no footsteps. To get to that back door, you had to cross 20 feet of the loudest hardwood floor in the city. I had been awake in the absolute quiet of the night. I would have heard the floorboards. There were no creaks. No one was walking, just the sudden, violent rattling of metal. And it sounded angry. It sounded frustrated, like someone was furious that the door was closed. I held my breath. I listened. The rattling at the back door stopped. A second later, the heavy front door on the opposite side of the house began to shake. Loudly, the brass handle clattered violently against the wood. It was impossible. No one could move from the back of the house to the front of the house in a single second without making a sound. My rational mind began to fracture. I tried to convince myself it was an elaborate prank, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy. It was pressing down on my chest. Then, the entire house woke up. The window latches in my room began to shake. The closet doors rattled in their frames. Every door downstairs, every window on the first floor, all of them began to violently shake in unison. Real loud, real angry. The noise was deafening. An overwhelming cacophony of rattling metal and shaking wood. Yet, what made it terrifying was the overall silence underneath the noise. It was an old, quiet neighborhood. You hardly heard any noise at night except the occasional passing car. There was no wind outside. No storm. Just this aggressive, localized assault on the boundaries of the house. Something was trying to get in, or something was already inside, trying to get out. I pushed myself up on my elbows, my heart hammering against my ribs. I decided I had to get up. I had to investigate. I had to prove it was just a trick. I shifted my legs to the edge of the bed. Before my feet could touch the floor, a mechanical hum cut through the rattling. The exhaust fan in the bathroom turned on. The bathroom was directly next to my room. It shared a wall with my bed. The only way to reach that bathroom was to walk down the hallway right outside my open door. The floorboards in that hallway were the creakiest in the entire house. No one had walked past my door. I was staring right at the hallway. It was empty. My blood turned to ice. As I remember this now, the hairs on my arms are standing straight up. Then, a sliver of yellow light bled out from under the bathroom door and spilled across the hallway floor into my room. The bathroom light had just been switched on. Someone, or something, was in there. I pulled my legs back into the bed, retreating under the covers like a terrified child. I sat frozen, staring at that sliver of light on the floor. I couldn't blink. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped in a cage of my own terror. And then, the bed began to vibrate. It started as a low hum deep within the mattress, but it escalated quickly. It became violent. The heavy wooden bed frame began to shake, not like a heavy truck rolling by on the street outside. This was shaking hard. Intentionally, the mattress bucked under me. I threw myself down flat, gripping the edges of the mattress with white-knuckled fingers. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't look. I refused to look. If I opened my eyes, I knew I would see a transparent face floating above me in the dark. I lay there, completely paralyzed by a primal, suffocating dread. Sweat poured down my face, soaking the collar of my shirt. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I genuinely wondered how I was not having a heart attack. The sheer volume of fear in my veins felt lethal. The violent shaking lasted for 30 seconds. 30 seconds of physical assault. It felt like an eternity. I just held on in the dark, listening to my rapid heartbeat, waiting for whatever had taken hold of the room to finally consume me. And then, instantly, it stopped. The bed froze. The rattling windows fell silent. The violent shaking of the downstairs doors ceased abruptly. The sudden absence of noise was jarring. The silence rushed back into the room, thick and suffocating. The only sound left was the mechanical hum of the bathroom fan next door. I didn't move. I didn't open my eyes. I was terrified that any movement, any sign of life would draw its attention back to me. I lay there in the dark for 10 minutes. 10 minutes of agonizing suspense. Every second stretched to its absolute limit. No noise, no movement, just the drone of the fan. I tried to slow my breathing, taking shallow, silent gasps of the stale air. My skeptical mind was desperately trying to build a wall against the impossible reality of what had just happened. And then, the wall shattered. The entire house erupted. It didn't build up this time. It started all at once, real loud. The bed launched itself. It didn't just shake, it moved. I felt the heavy wooden frame drag across the floorboards, sliding to the right, pulling me closer to the open door of the room. Downstairs, the locks and doors were going absolutely crazy. This was not in my head. This was not a trick of the mind. I knew the shaking was real, because of what happened next. I opened my eyes. Across the room, my computer sat on a small desk. It had been in sleep mode, but the violent movement of the room had knocked the mouse off the edge of the desk. The movement woke the computer. The monitor flared to life, casting a cold, creepy blue glow across the dark corner of the room. The blue light flickered as the monitor shook violently on the desk. In that strobe light illumination, I could see the shadows dancing wildly against the walls. The unnatural blue hue made everything look dead. I assumed the others downstairs had to be freaking out. The noise was apocalyptic. I couldn't stay in that bed anymore. I had to move. I finally gathered the courage to get up and check on them. I took a sharp breath, gripped the edge of the blanket, and prepared to throw myself out of the bed. The moment I opened my eyes wider and started to rise, the bed slowly stopped shaking. It didn't stop abruptly this time. It slowed down, gradually. I froze, half risen from the mattress. Downstairs, the symphony of rattling began to fade. But not all at once. It stopped in a distinct pattern, one at a time, clockwise. First, the front door went completely silent. Then, the next window. Then the side door, moving clockwise around the perimeter of the house. I could track its progress by the fading noise. Finally, it reached the back of the house. The back door by the kitchen, the very first door that had started it all. It rattled one last time, and then it stopped. A split second later, the yellow light spilling from under the bathroom door vanished. It plunged the hallway back into total darkness. Once again, there was absolute silence. Save for the bathroom fan. I lay back down very slowly. My heart was racing. I stared into the blue-lit room, wondering what I should do. I debated getting up and snooping around, but the thought of stepping out into that pitch-black hallway paralyzed me all over again. I knew if I left the bed, I would never be able to sleep, so I stayed. I listened to the dead house. I waited for 20 minutes. I counted the seconds, watching the dark doorway. After exactly 20 minutes, the bathroom fan clicked off. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most profound silence I have ever experienced. It felt like the air itself had been drained from the house. Sheer mental exhaustion finally overpowered my terror. Around 4 in the morning, I slipped into a restless sleep. When the morning sun finally broke, I woke up, threw off the covers, and ran downstairs. My friend was sitting in the living room, casually watching television. The normalcy of the scene felt offensive. I demanded to know what happened. I asked him what the hell that was about last night. He looked at me with genuine confusion. He said he didn't hear a thing. I knew he was partially deaf, but the sheer volume of the noise, the physical vibration of the house, it was impossible to sleep through. I thought maybe he had finally pulled the ultimate prank. He told me he had gotten up once or twice during the night to use the restroom down the hall from him. I asked him if he had turned on the fan. If he had closed the door. He said no. He never closes the door or turns on the fan when he goes at night. But he swore he still didn't feel or hear anything out of the ordinary. We asked the tenant in the basement. She said the same thing. She heard absolutely nothing. She had fallen asleep right away. But then, they both stopped. They looked at each other, and then at me. They asked me what time it happened. They asked if it started around 2 in the morning, because most of the strange things that happen in that house, the things that drive the tenants out, always happen around 2 in the morning. I remembered looking at the digital clock on the nightstand, right when the bed first started to violently move. I remembered the exact numbers glowing in the dark. It was exactly 2:16 a.m. I used to be a skeptic. I used to want to experience the unknown. Now, I keep the lights on. I don't ask for proof anymore. Because once you invite it in, once you acknowledge it in the dark, it knows you are there, and it will show you exactly what you asked for. We wanted isolation. We actively sought it out. We drove hours away from the arteries of civilization, deep into the suffocating white of the mountains, believing that distance meant peace. We rented a single-story log cabin miles from the nearest paved road, ready to be completely swallowed by an incoming winter storm. The idea was simple: to vanish for a few days, to exist in a warm, insulated bubble, while the rest of the world froze over. The cabin was not large. It was not luxurious. It was a simple 4-room box sitting in the middle of an ocean of ancient pines, a living room that smelled faintly of damp ash and old dust, a cramped, narrow kitchen, a small bathroom, and a bedroom with a single window that stared out into the endless, sprawling void of the tree line. As the afternoon bled into evening, the storm finally arrived. It didn't start gradually. It descended like a heavy curtain dropping over the earth. Within an hour, the satellite signal choked and died. The television screen dissolved into a swarm of gray static, and the digital clocks on our devices stopped updating the outside world. We were entirely cut off, just the two of us, sealed inside a wooden box, surrounded by millions of acres of absolute emptiness. Or so I thought. The evening began to creep in, bringing with it that liminal, unsettling shade of twilight where the sky turns the color of bruised iron. The snow was falling impossibly fast, thick and heavy, drowning out all ambient noise. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. It pressed against the eardrums like physical weight. I wanted to capture it. The sheer scale of the emptiness, the haunting beauty of a world completely devoid of life. I bundled up. Thick boots, heavy coat, gloves. I told my partner I would only be gone for 10 minutes to take some photographs of the blizzard. 10 minutes. I unlocked the heavy wooden door. I pushed it open against the rising drift of snow. I stepped out into the biting, merciless cold and pulled the door shut behind me until the latch clicked into place. Instantly, the warmth was gone. The world was nothing but shifting gray shapes and falling white. I took one step forward. And then I stopped. The silence around the cabin was absolute. But beneath the small overhang of the wooden awning, shielded from the fresh, rapidly accumulating snowfall, the pristine surface of the ground was broken. Footprints. Deep, heavy, deliberate impressions stamped into the frost. I stared at them, my mind blanking, trying to force logic into a situation that had none. We had not been outside since we arrived. We had not walked around the front of the cabin. Yet here were tracks. They led directly up to our front door. They stopped perfectly centered before the wood. And then the prints doubled over. Whoever left them had stood there, facing our door, before turning around and walking in the exact opposite direction. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather flooded my veins. It pooled in my stomach. The absolute certainty that we were alone evaporated, replaced instantly by the sickening realization that we were blind, deaf, and trapped. I didn't turn back to the door. I couldn't open it and look at my partner, not yet. I needed to know. The instinct to understand the threat outweighed the instinct to run. I followed the tracks. I moved slowly, placing my boots near the deep impressions left in the snow. They hugged the perimeter of the cabin, moving with a deliberate, slow, agonizing weight. They didn't wander. They were purposeful. The trail led directly around the right corner of the structure. I held my breath, peeking around the rough logs, half expecting someone to be standing right there in the swirling white. Nothing. Just the tracks. They led straight to the bedroom window. I approached the glass slowly. I looked at the deep grooves in the snow where someone had stood. And then I looked up, through the glass. I could see inside. I could see the warm yellow light of the bedside lamp. And I could see my partner, sitting on the edge of the mattress, completely oblivious, looking down at a tablet. A sitting duck in a lit box. My heart froze. The breath caught in my throat. I raised my hand and tapped the glass. My partner looked up, smiled, and offered a small wave, assuming I was just taking pictures. I waved back. A stiff, terrifyingly hollow gesture. I stepped away from the glass. The tracks didn't stop there. I continued to follow them, rounding the back of the cabin, tracing the deep, violent impressions as they circled to the other side. They led directly to the living room window. Same thing. Deep depressions in the snow. Someone had been standing there. Standing for a long time. Looking in, watching us exist in our little cage. But the tracks didn't stop at the living room window either. They began to pull away from the cabin. I stood there in the freezing wind, staring at the trail as it descended away from the structure, leading straight out into the deep, suffocating darkness of the surrounding woods. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to turn around, to go inside, to lock the doors, draw the blinds, and wait for daylight. But the terror inside me demanded an answer. I needed to know how far away this person was. I needed to know if they were coming back. I followed the trail into the trees. The moment I stepped past the tree line, the wind died down, blocked by the massive trunks of the ancient pines. The silence here was worse. It was thick. It felt like holding your breath underwater. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint gray ambient light reflecting off the snow. I walked. One step. Another, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots. And then, I stopped, up ahead, standing in the space between two massive, towering pines. A figure. It was a man. He was wearing a heavy, dark coat that swallowed his shape in the gloom. But he wasn't walking. He wasn't moving toward me. He wasn't retreating into the forest. He was standing perfectly still. He was facing a massive tree trunk. His shoulders were slouched forward, heavy and limp. His head was bowed downward, staring directly at the roots buried beneath the snow. He didn't move. He didn't twitch. I stood there, 20 yards away, my lungs burning, waiting for the rise and fall of his shoulders to indicate that he was breathing. But there was nothing. The snow was piling up on the hood of his coat. It was gathering on his slouched shoulders in thick, white mounds. He had been standing like that, facing a tree, staring at the ground, for a very long time. The urge to speak, to call out and ask if he needed help, died completely in the back of my throat. You don't speak to something that moves like that. You don't speak to things that stand like statues in the frozen dark. The posture was entirely wrong. Deranged. Broken. I didn't turn around. I couldn't give him my back. I began to walk backward, step by agonizing step. The snow crunched loudly beneath my heel, a deafening, violent sound in the absolute quiet of the forest. He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. I took another step back, and another, keeping my eyes locked on that dark, slouched shape until the shadows of the trees finally swallowed him whole. As soon as I lost visual contact, panic took over. I spun around and sprinted. I stomped through the deep snow, my lungs tearing, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. I threw myself against the front door, turned the knob, and practically collapsed into the hallway, slamming the heavy wood shut behind me. My partner immediately came out of the bedroom. The smile from the window was gone, replaced by a look of total confusion, and then, slowly, dawning terror. They saw my face. They saw the absolute, undisguised horror in my eyes. I didn't want to say it, but I had to. I told them about the tracks. I told them about the windows. I told them about the shape in the woods. The reaction was immediate. Bags were unzipped. Clothes were shoved inside. The frantic, chaotic energy of prey, trying to flee a trap. We are leaving. Right now. But I stopped it. I looked at the dark windows. I thought about the miles of unplowed roads. I thought about the blinding whiteout conditions outside. If we run now, we might die in the cold. And if we get stuck out there, we are sitting targets in a tin can. We stay. We lock everything. Every deadbolt was thrown. Every window latch was clicked into place. We pulled the heavy curtains shut, sealing off the glass. Sealing off the outside world, the night settled over the cabin like a shroud. We turned off every light. We didn't want to be silhouetted against the fabric. We sat in the pitch black of the bedroom, entirely clothed, coats still on, boots laced tight, staring at the ceiling, listening. When you sit in the dark for long enough, the mind starts to betray you. The wind playing against the roof sounds like footsteps. The settling of the wood sounds like someone prying at a floorboard. The isolation amplifies every single vibration until you feel like you are losing your mind. We sat there for hours, just listening to the small flakes of snow aggressively ticking against the glass. It was almost relaxing, the rhythmic tapping of the storm. The exhaustion was pulling at my eyelids. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a heavy narcotic dread. I was just starting to drift, just starting to believe that maybe the man in the woods was just a hallucination born of cold and paranoia. And then the tapping on the glass changed. It was no longer the chaotic, scattered clicking of ice and snow. It was rhythmic. It was deliberate. Right against the bedroom window, inches away from where our heads rested against the headboard, we both froze. The air in the room vanished. The darkness suddenly felt infinitely heavy. Neither of us breathed. Neither of us moved a single muscle. We just laid there in the pitch black, listening to the impossible reality of what was on the other side of that thin pane of glass. It was a knock from a human hand. I slowly, silently sat up. I reached out in the dark, finding my partner's arm, gripping it with a bruising force. I pulled them up. No words. No whispers. The silence had to remain unbroken. We had nothing. No weapons. No way to defend ourselves against whatever was waiting out there in the freezing void. We slipped out of the bedroom, stepping softly onto the wooden floorboards, moving like ghosts into the living room. The total darkness of the cabin was our only shield. We stood by the front door, keys in hand. The vehicle was parked 20 feet away. 20 feet of deep snow and blinding wind. We would have to leave everything behind. We would have to make a blind run for the doors and pray the engine started. I reached for the deadbolt, my fingers trembling against the cold metal, and then, from the opposite side of the cabin, a knock at the living room window. They were circling. They were playing with us, testing the perimeter, pushing us toward the exit. It was now or never. I grabbed the handle, threw the deadbolt back with a loud, violent crack, and ripped the front door open. The cold hit us like a physical blow. We ran. We tore through the deep snow, our boots sinking, the wind screaming in our ears. I pressed the unlock button on the key fob. The horn chirped. The lights flashed, a beacon in the terrifying dark. We practically threw ourselves into the vehicle. I slammed my door shut, the sound booming in the enclosed space. My partner slammed theirs. The locks clicked down instantly. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, deafening sound of machinery and power. My hand slammed onto the headlight switch. The twin beams of harsh halogen light tore through the heavy curtain of falling snow, violently illuminating the front of the log cabin. And there he was. He was no longer at the windows. He was no longer circling the perimeter. He was standing dead center in front of the cabin. But he wasn't looking at us. He wasn't looking at the vehicle. He was standing inches away from the solid log wall of the cabin structure, facing the wood. His shoulders slouched heavily forward, his head bowed down, hiding his face entirely against the rough timber of the wall. He was perfectly, impossibly still, not acknowledging the roaring engine, not flinching at the blinding headlights washing over his snow-covered coat. Just standing there, facing the wall, existing in the absolute, terrifying quiet of his own mind. I didn't wait for him to move. I didn't wait for him to turn around. I threw the vehicle into reverse, the tires spinning, biting violently into the snow, and we tore backward out into the unplowed road. We drove. We drove through the blinding storm, our eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead, the heater blasting, the silence inside the car thick and suffocating. We didn't look back. We didn't say a single word for hours, because we both knew there are things out there in the deep, quiet places of the world. Things that do not think like us. Things that do not act like us. Things that simply stand in the freezing dark and wait. I am 32 years old now, but the nights still do not belong to me. They belong to the silence, to the cold, and to the things that wait just beyond the edge of the light. My mind is permanently tethered to a single freezing winter, back when I was only 14 years old. We were supposed to be healing, My family had been torn apart, shattered when my father abandoned us for a new life, a model in France. The betrayal had left us hollow, drifting. We had moved to England for a fresh start, a desperate attempt to outrun the ghost of the family we used to be. But the shadows followed us, and so we sought refuge across the ocean, traveling to the deep, isolated wilderness of Canada to stay with my grandfather and grandmother. We hadn't seen them in a long time. The cabin was buried in the woods, surrounded by an endless sea of ancient, towering pines that stood like silent watchers in the snow. It was a beautiful place, but the winter there was unforgiving. It was the kind of cold that doesn't just numb your skin, it sinks into your bones, it slows your heartbeat, it silences the world. We were inside, bathed in the warm, flickering glow of the fire, the smell of a heavy winter roast filling the small space. For a brief moment, the world felt safe. The heavy wooden walls seemed thick enough to keep out the bitter dark. And then, the silence broke. It was a scream, an echoing, agonizing wail that sliced through the heavy timber of the cabin walls. It didn't sound human. It vibrated through the floorboards, sinking directly into my stomach. Me, being the person I was, I forced a hollow laugh from my throat. I shrugged my shoulders, looking around the table, pretending it was nothing. Pretending I wasn't entirely consumed by dread. But beneath my skin, I was paralyzed. I was utterly petrified of whatever could stand in the pitch-black freezing woods and tear a sound like that from its lungs. My grandfather didn't laugh. His eyes darkened, locking onto the heavy oak door. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight. "Let's go get some layers on," he whispered, his voice grim, devoid of any comfort. "We need to go check what it is." I was unusually massive for a 14-year-old boy, over 6 feet tall, pushing 200 pounds, heavily built. To the outside world, I was an imposing shadow, someone you wouldn't dare stand up to, someone who looked like they could fight the devil himself. So, I swallowed the lump of terror in my throat, and I said yes. We pulled on our thick, heavy coats. I watched my grandfather reach into the dark corner of the room, pulling out his rifle. The metallic clack of the action being checked was the only sound in the room. It was meant for safety, but it only made the dread heavier. We opened the door, and the freezing air hit us like a physical blow. We stepped out into the black, our boots crunching violently against the thick layer of snow. We walked slowly, moving away from the safety of the cabin's light, into the mouth of the tree line, 50 meters. That was all it took. The beam of the flashlight swept across the blinding white snow until it hit a massive, dark shape heaving on the ground. It was a moose, but it wasn't just lying there. Its massive body was pinned violently to the frozen earth, crushed beneath the sheer weight of an impossibly large boulder. The animal's chest heaved, its eyes rolling back in its skull, and its mouth opened, letting out that exact same horrific, echoing scream. It was a sound of absolute suffering. We had to put it out of its misery. The sharp crack of the rifle shattered the quiet, and the animal finally went limp. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. We stood there, the cold biting at our exposed faces. We needed to call someone, to get help moving a corpse of that size, but the exhaustion was heavy, and thick, blinding flakes of snow had already begun to fall from the pitch-black sky. But as we turned to leave, something tugged at the back of my mind. I looked at the massive boulder resting on the crushed animal, and my blood ran entirely cold. There were no cliffs around us, no mountains, no elevated ridges. The ground in every direction was flat, endless woods. There was absolutely nowhere for a rock of that immense size to have come from. It was as if it had simply dropped from the freezing sky, or been deliberately placed there by hands too large to comprehend. I didn't speak. I didn't want to hear the sound of my own voice trembling. We hurried back to the cabin, shutting the heavy wooden door behind us, locking it tight. I sat down, forcing myself to laugh quietly in my head, trying to convince my racing heart that the crushing anxiety was just childish imagination. The dark plays tricks. The cold plays tricks. It was nothing. But all of that changed. Exactly 20 minutes later, as we sat in the quiet cabin, the night outside shattered again. The scream, it was the exact same pitch, the exact same agonizing volume, echoing from the exact same spot in the dark. Every single person in the room jolted. Our blood turned to ice. I moved to the window, my trembling hands wiping the condensation from the frigid glass. Pressing my face against the cold pane, to peer out into the clearing. My stomach plummeted into an endless abyss. The clearing was empty. The massive, heavy corpse of the moose was gone. I stood there, unable to breathe, my mind fracturing as it tried to process the impossible. How does a giant carcass pinned to the freezing earth by a rock that weighed twice as much as my own heavy frame simply disappear into the thin air? Without a single sound? Without a single trace? And then a shadow moved. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. He was standing perfectly still in the freezing dark, his eyes locked directly onto the window, directly onto me. He raised his arm, and the dim moonlight caught the heavy black metal of a Glock, aiming directly at my chest through the glass. His voice didn't waver. It cut through the cold, loud, and completely devoid of humanity. Anyone moving, and this big one dies. He held us completely hostage with a single glance, a predator who had found his prey locked in a wooden cage. But there was one thing he didn't know. Deep in the pocket of my coat, my fingers were wrapped tightly around the cold handle of a small penknife. I carried it everywhere, a silent guard against the world, because of a terrifying incident I had barely survived when I was younger. I never let go of it. The man holding the gun shifted his gaze. Just for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked toward the rest of my family trembling in the background. He looked away. I didn't think. The silence in my head vanished, replaced by a roaring flood of primal adrenaline. I threw myself forward, bursting out the door and crashing into the freezing night. Before he could pull the trigger, before he could even register my massive frame hurtling toward him, I lunged, driving the small blade of the penknife directly into the back of the hand, gripping the heavy pistol. The metal hit the snow with a dull thud. I slammed into his chest, tackling him violently into the freezing dirt. We rolled into the darkness, a chaotic storm of flying fists and crunching snow. I hit him, throwing all 200 pounds of my weight behind every single punch, but he didn't stop. He didn't cover up. After every devastating blow, I landed on his jaw. His bloody hands scrambled desperately through the snow, his fingers frantically searching the white powder for the black metal of the gun. But that wasn't the scariest part. As I sat over him, swinging my fists down into his face over and over again, I looked into his eyes. He wasn't grimacing. He wasn't crying out in pain. He was smiling, a wide, empty, terrifying smile stretched across his bloody face. As he took every single punch, I panicked. The smile broke my mind. I needed him to stop reaching. I needed to destroy his ability to hold that weapon. I raised my heavy boot, aiming directly for the hand clawing through the dark snow, planning to stomp it until he forgot about the gun entirely. Then, a flash of blinding light, and a deafening, concussive bang. A wave of intense, searing heat punched directly through my shoulder. The bullet ripped cleanly into my flesh and exited out the back, spraying a fine mist of warmth across the freezing snow. He had found it. The pain didn't register. It was immediately swallowed by an ocean of pure, violent adrenaline. I didn't fall. I brought my heavy boot crashing down onto his hand with horrifying force. I heard the sickening sound of the bone snapping in multiple places beneath my heel, destroying his fingers entirely. The smile finally faltered. I shifted my weight, bringing my boot down violently against his ribs, feeling them cave beneath the pressure. I kept going. I started kicking him, burying my boot into the side of his skull, over and over and over, until his eyes rolled back, until the dreadful, impossible smile was completely wiped away, and his body went entirely limp in the snow. The silence returned, heavy, suffocating, and metallic with the smell of blood. The police didn't arrive until 10 excruciating minutes had passed, flashing red and blue lights tearing through the ancient trees, shattering the isolation. I was rushed away in the back of an ambulance, my face mangled, several teeth missing from my mouth, my jaw fractured, a hole bleeding steadily from my shoulder. The monster I had left in the snow was destroyed, his hand completely shattered, all 5 fingers crushed into oblivion. 3 of his ribs were snapped in half. His nose was broken, his jaw fractured, his brain swimming in a deep concussion. It wasn't until days later, sitting in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, that we learned the truth. The maniac in the snow wasn't just a wanderer. He was a ghost. He had broken out of a high-security prison just weeks prior, a violent entity slipping through the cracks of the world, wandering into the deep, freezing woods. I often sit in the quiet now, thinking about how close we were to the absolute edge. If I hadn't carried that small penknife, a quiet gift from my father from a past life, I would be buried in that freezing dirt. My mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, they would have been left to the mercy of a smiling man in the middle of a screaming forest. I don't close my eyes when the sun goes down anymore. The dark is too loud. I am known as an owl now. I sleep while the sun is high in the sky, while the shadows are banished, while nothing can hide in the corners of my room. I walk through the daylight, watching the faces of the people passing by. Just know that every single person you hold close, the ones who have your absolute trust, your respect, they are the exceptions. Keep them close, hold on to them tightly, because when the lights go out and you are alone in the quiet, you realize the horrifying truth. Not everybody in this world is a nice person. Some of them are just waiting for the cold to set in, waiting in the dark, waiting to smile. It was my sophomore year of college, a time that was supposed to be defined by newfound freedom, by the exciting transition into true independence. I had just signed the lease on a new apartment, a modest, slightly run-down two-bedroom unit on the second floor of a quiet complex. The building itself was older, settling into its foundations with constant groans and settling noises. But to me, it was perfect. It was a sanctuary away from the chaotic dormitories. My roommate and I settled in quickly. The layout was simple but effective. 2 bedrooms positioned on opposite ends of a short, narrow hallway, separated by 2 small bathrooms. This spatial division gave us both a sense of complete privacy, a barrier between our separate lives. For the first week, everything was idyllic. We arranged our furniture, we filled the fridge, we established a comfortable, easygoing rhythm. We got along perfectly, respecting each other's boundaries while sharing the common spaces, but true silence rarely exists in places where people live. Buildings have a pulse, a heartbeat made of shifting wood, humming pipes, and drafts. My bedroom was situated closest to the main living area, directly adjacent to the kitchen. And because of this proximity, I became intimately familiar with every sound the apartment produced in the dead of night. It started subtly. A few days into our new living arrangement, I began to wake up in the middle of the night, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. The sounds were always muffled but distinct: the faint squeak of a cabinet hinge, the soft, padded shuffle of bare feet on the cold linoleum floor, the delicate clinking of glassware. I would lie there in the dark, staring up at the invisible ceiling, listening to the nocturnal activities. I never felt any alarm. Human beings are incredibly adept at rationalizing the unknown. Our brains automatically search for the most logical, comforting explanation to prevent panic. So naturally, I assumed it was my roommate. College life is stressful. Studying often extends deep into the early hours, and midnight snacking is a universal habit. I pictured him standing by the open refrigerator, bathing in its pale, artificial light, searching for a quick bite before returning to bed. Satisfied with this completely rational explanation, I would turn over, bury my face in my pillow, and let the gentle, rhythmic hum of the kitchen appliances sing me back into a deep, dreamless sleep. This pattern continued without disruption until the second week. I began to notice a drastic change in my roommate. It wasn't just a mood swing, it was a physical deterioration. The vibrant, energetic guy the first had moved in with was slowly fading. His skin took on an unhealthy, ashen pallor. Heavy, dark circles bruised the delicate skin beneath his eyes. He stopped leaving his room, he stopped attending classes. When I did see him, he moved with a lethargic, heavy sluggishness, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on his shoulders. When I asked him what was wrong, he avoided my gaze. He stared at the floor, his voice barely a whisper. He told me he felt physically drained, completely hollowed out. He chalked it up to severe homesickness and a sudden, overwhelming bout of depression. He confessed that the university environment was crushing him, and that he had made the difficult decision to drop out and return to his parents' house. I tried to offer sympathy. I helped him pack his boxes, but deep down, a quiet, selfish part of me felt a flicker of anticipation. I was watching my friend leave, but I was also inheriting an entire apartment to myself. No more compromising on the thermostat. No more sharing the television. And, most importantly, no more middle-of-the-night kitchen noises interrupting my sleep. I envisioned a quiet, peaceful sanctuary, a place of total solitude, I couldn't have been more wrong. The very first night I spent entirely alone in that apartment, the atmosphere changed. Without another human presence to absorb the silence, the quiet became deafening. It was a heavy, oppressive stillness, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind of silence that feels like it's actively watching you. I locked the front door, threw the deadbolt, latched the chain guard. I checked the windows. I was entirely, undeniably alone. I crawled into bed, pulling the thick comforter up to my chin, relishing the solitude. I drifted off relatively quickly, exhausted from the day's events. And then, I woke up, my eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black. The air was perfectly still. But there it was again, the sound. It was coming from the kitchen, a slow, deliberate scraping noise. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the linoleum. Then, the distinct, unmistakable click of a drawer sliding open, and the metallic rattle of silverware. My heart immediately seized in my chest. A cold knot of pure adrenaline formed in the pit of my stomach. My brain desperately tried to fire its usual comforting logic. It's just him getting a snack, but the rational side of my mind ruthlessly crushed the thought. He is gone. You watched him leave. The door is locked from the inside. There was absolutely no one else in the apartment. I lay frozen for what felt like an eternity, my breath trapped in my throat, straining to hear any further movement. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I knew I couldn't just lie there. The primal instinct to protect my territory warred with the overwhelming urge to hide under the covers. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed the heavy blankets aside. The fabric rustling against the sheets sounded as loud as a gunshot in the terrifying quiet. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, my bare feet touching the icy floorboards. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly, and began the long, dreadful walk toward the bedroom door. Every step was calculated, silent. I pressed my back against the wall of the narrow hallway, inching my way toward the open archway of the kitchen. The pale silver glow of the moon bled through the living room blinds, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. I held my breath, leaned my head around the corner, and looked into the kitchen. It was entirely empty. There was no intruder, no broken window, no sign of forced entry. But as my eyes scanned the room, they locked onto an anomaly. Lying dead center in the middle of the kitchen floor was a knife. It was one of our large, heavy chef's knives, the kind used for carving thick meat. It rested perfectly flat on the linoleum, the sharp steel blade catching the moonlight, gleaming with a quiet, menacing silver hue. I stood completely paralyzed, staring at the weapon. My mind raced, trying to formulate a rational explanation. How did it get there? Did it fall from the counter? But the counter was completely bare. Did it fall from the drying rack? The rack was empty. It was lying perfectly in the center of the room, as if it had been deliberately placed there. I swallowed hard, the dry click of my throat echoing in the silence. I stepped into the kitchen, my eyes darting to every dark corner, waiting for someone to leap out from the shadows. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I bent down, my fingers wrapping around the cold, black handle of the knife. I stood up, opened the top drawer and placed it back inside, pushing the drawer shut until it clicked softly. I walked back to my room, locked my bedroom door, and crawled back into bed. I forced myself to believe the lies my brain was spinning. It must have fallen. A heavy truck driving by must have rattled the building. It was a bizarre coincidence. Nothing more. Days bled into a week. The apartment remained silent. I attended my classes. I studied. I tried to push the memory of the knife to the darkest recesses of my mind. The complete absence of any strange noises during those days slowly lulled me into a false sense of security. I began to convince myself that I had overreacted, that living alone was just playing tricks on my anxious mind. Then came the night that shattered my reality. It was the dead of night. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3 a.m. exactly. The world outside was completely devoid of sound. No cars, no wind, no distant sirens. I was pulled from my sleep not by a loud crash, but by a subtle, insidious noise. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. And it wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was coming from inside my bedroom, from inside my closet. My eyes flew wide open. I stared straight up at the dark ceiling, my body immediately seizing with an icy rigidity. I didn't dare turn my head. I just listened. The scratching continued. It sounded like long, hardened fingernails, gently testing the wood of the closet door from the inside. Then, the atmosphere in the room changed entirely. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. A freezing, unnatural chill rapidly flooded the space, wrapping around my body like a damp, icy shroud. The heavy, suffocating cold seeped directly into my bones. The tiny hairs on my arms, my legs, the back of my neck, all stood rigidly on end, a primal, biological response to a predator in the room. The air grew impossibly thick, heavy with a static electricity that made my skin crawl. It felt as though the very oxygen was being sucked out of the space, replaced by an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I slowly, mechanically, turned my head toward the closet. The closet door was partially open, revealing the pitch-black void within, and standing just outside the frame, merging with the shadows, was a figure. It was towering, draped in complete and absolute darkness. It had no discernible features, no face, no hands. It was just a massive, cloaked silhouette that seemed to absorb the faint light in the room like a black hole. It resembled something entirely inhuman, a wraith born from nightmare, standing perfectly, unnervingly still. It was watching me. I couldn't scream. My vocal cords were completely paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated terror. My chest heaved, gasping for air that felt too thick to breathe. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, burying my face deep into the mattress, desperately praying to any listening deity that I was trapped in a hyper-realistic night terror. When I finally gathered the strength to open my eyes a few agonizing seconds later, the corner was empty. The figure had vanished. The suffocating pressure in the room slowly began to dissipate, the temperature incrementally returning to normal. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, staring at the empty corner, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally broke, I was a complete wreck. My mind desperately tried to rationalize what I had seen. I convinced myself it was sleep paralysis, a waking dream brought on by extreme fatigue and the stress of living alone. I clung to this scientific explanation, like a life raft in a raging ocean. I dragged my exhausted, trembling body to my classes, walking through the campus like an animated corpse. My brain was completely fried, my physical energy utterly depleted. When evening finally arrived, I returned to the apartment. I was so bone-tired that the fear was temporarily overridden by pure physical exhaustion. I barely managed to take off my shoes before I collapsed onto my bed. My heavy eyelids fluttered shut, and I immediately plunged into a deep, dark abyss of sleep. I don't know how many hours passed. I don't know what time the darkness decided to return, but the memory of waking up that night is permanently, agonizingly burned into my consciousness. I remember slowly pulling out of sleep, groggy and disoriented. What pulled me into consciousness wasn't a sudden shock, but a noise, a sickening, wet, guttural noise. And it was coming from directly behind my head. I instinctively tried to jerk my head back, to roll over and confront whatever was making that sound. But my body didn't respond. I tried to move my arms, to push myself up. Nothing. My legs were anchored to the mattress. My jaw was clamped tightly shut. The horrifying realization crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. I was completely, utterly paralyzed. I was lying on my side, facing the blank, pale wall of my bedroom. The only parts of my body that obeyed my command were my eyes, darting frantically, desperately side to side in their sockets. My brain screamed commands to my nervous system, but the connection was entirely severed. I was a prisoner inside my own flesh. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribcage, a frantic, deafening rhythm that echoed in the silence of my skull. Panic, pure, concentrated panic, flooded my veins. Then, the physical sensation began. I felt a sudden freezing draft of air, not sweeping across the room, but localized, exhaling slowly and deliberately against the exposed skin of my neck. Something was leaning directly over me. I strained my ears, desperately listening for the sound of floorboards creaking, the rustle of fabric, the heavy thud of footsteps. If someone had broken in, if someone was standing over my bed, there had to be physical evidence of their movement. But there was absolute silence. No footsteps. No rustling. Whatever was standing behind me hadn't walked across the room. It had simply manifested. And then, the mattress began to move. It started as a low, rumbling vibration, deep within the springs of the bed. Then, it escalated. The shaking became vicious, violent. The entire bed frame rattled and shuddered, as if an immensely heavy, invisible weight was rhythmically pressing down on the mattress, violently shaking the bed with an aggressive, malicious fury. I was violently jostled back and forth, my paralyzed body bouncing helplessly against the sheets. The terror was so absolute, so entirely overwhelming, that I felt my mind teetering on the very edge of complete insanity. Through sheer, desperate willpower, I forced my eyes to roll back, straining my peripheral vision to the absolute maximum limit, attempting to catch a glimpse of the corner of the room behind me. The shadows seemed to warp and twist, and there, standing amidst the violently shaking room, was the dark figure. It was the same towering, cloaked anomaly from the previous night. The same black void that consumed the light. But this time, it wasn't featureless. Piercing through the dense, suffocating blackness of its cowl were two eyes. They were burning, glowing with a sickening, luminescent red glare. They looked like the superheated embers of a dying furnace, radiating an ancient, predatory malevolence. They weren't human eyes. They were the eyes of something demonic, something entirely born of darkness and suffering. Those glowing red orbs stared directly into my helpless, paralyzed form. I could feel the sheer hatred emanating from them, a palpable, physical force that sought to entirely break my spirit. My heart sank so deep into my chest, I thought it might stop completely. I was staring into the face of pure evil, and I was completely defenseless. I had never been a deeply religious person. I had grown up with a passing understanding of theology, but my faith had never been tested. I had never truly believed in unseen forces, but in that singular, agonizing moment of absolute helplessness, staring into the crimson eyes of a nightmare, I found desperation. I closed my tightly strained eyes. I locked away the image of the red-eyed shadow, and I began to pray. I couldn't speak the words aloud. My lips were sealed tight by the paralysis, but my mind screamed them. I prayed with a ferocity and a desperation I didn't know I possessed. I begged for salvation. I pleaded with the universe, with any benevolent force that existed in the cosmos, to protect me. The bed continued to shake violently beneath me, throwing my stiff body back and forth. The freezing, unnatural breath continued to wash over the back of my neck, threatening to freeze the blood in my veins, but I refused to stop. I focused every single microscopic ounce of my mental energy into the silent chant. I began to actively summon images of everything good in my life. I pictured the warm, smiling faces of my parents, the laughter of my closest friends, the brightest, happiest memories I could drag from my past. I built a mental fortress of light and warmth, desperately trying to push back the suffocating tide of darkness that was trying to drown me. It became a silent, unseen battle of wills, the malicious entity vibrating the bed, and the desperate, terrified student praying for his life. And then, it happened. The violent shaking of the mattress abruptly stopped. It didn't fade away gradually. It ceased instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The aggressive vibrations died out, leaving the room in a ringing, deafening silence. I didn't dare open my eyes. I didn't dare stop my mental chanting. I held on to the images of my family, holding them like a shield. Slowly, agonizingly, slowly, the suffocating pressure in the room began to recede. The localized, freezing breath vanished from the back of my neck. I could physically feel the oppressive, heavy aura retreating, pulling itself away from my bed, dragging its dark mass back into the far corner of the room. I lay completely motionless, wrapped in a thick sheen of cold sweat, my heart slowly decelerating from its frantic sprint. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. The silence remained, but the heavy, predatory weight was gone. Finally, a tiny prickle of sensation returned to my fingertips. My toes twitched against the sheets. The iron grip of the paralysis shattered, and control of my muscles rushed back into my limbs. The instant I regained mobility, survival instinct completely took over. I didn't slowly sit up. I didn't look around the room. I didn't even grab my phone or a pair of shoes. I violently threw my body sideways, launching myself off the mattress. My bare feet slammed against the hardwood floor, and I bolted. I lunged for the bedroom door, tearing it open and sprinting down the dark hallway with the speed of a hunted animal. I slammed into the front door of the apartment, my trembling hands fumbling desperately with the heavy deadbolt, twisting the lock and ripping the door open. I threw myself out into the brightly lit, sterile corridor of the apartment complex, the sudden fluorescent light burning my retinas. I didn't stop. I sprinted barefoot down the hallway until I reached my neighbor's door. I hammered on the wood with both fists, sobbing and hyperventilating, banging until the door finally swung open. My neighbor, groggy and deeply confused, stared at me as I practically collapsed into their living room, shaking uncontrollably, unable to form a coherent sentence. I never stepped foot in that bedroom again at night. I slept on my neighbor's uncomfortable sofa, waiting for the safety of the morning sun. When daylight finally broke, I returned to the apartment, but I refused to go alone. I brought my neighbor and 2 other friends, walking through the front door in the bright, comforting light of day. We packed all of my belongings into boxes in record time. I didn't care about organizing anything. I just wanted out. By the end of that very month, I had officially broken my lease. I willingly paid the exorbitant penalty fees, packed my boxes into a rented truck, and moved as far away from that complex as my meager budget would possibly allow. Years have passed since that terrifying semester. I moved on with my life, but the scars remain deeply embedded in my psychology. To this day, I absolutely refuse to sleep with the closet door open. When the house is entirely quiet and the temperature drops even slightly, my heart rate instantly spikes. I constantly think back to that mundane, slightly run-down apartment, the memory of the freezing air, the memory of the heavy kitchen knife gleaming maliciously on the cold linoleum floor. But mostly, I find my thoughts drifting back to my old roommate. I remember his pale, sunken face. I remember the dark, bruised rings under his eyes, his sudden, inexplicable exhaustion, his desperate, rapid escape back to his parents' home. He claimed he was dropping out due to a physical illness and severe homesickness. But now, armed with the horrifying knowledge of what resided in that apartment, I always wonder, what exactly did he experience in the dark isolation of his room? Did he wake up to the sound of scratching? Did he wake up completely paralyzed, unable to scream as his bed shook violently beneath him? Did he manage to force his eyes open, only to find those glowing, demonic red eyes staring back at him from the black void of the corner? Was he truly sick, or was his life force slowly being drained by a parasitic entity? Was he homesick, or was he being aggressively hunted? I will never know the answer. We lost touch shortly after he left, and a part of me is entirely too terrified to ever reach out and ask him. Some doors are better left permanently closed. Needless to say, I am eternally grateful that I escaped when I did, that I had the strength to run, but the darkest, most terrifying realization that still keeps me awake at night is the understanding that entities like that, things born of pure shadow and malice, they don't simply cease to exist when you leave. They don't die. They don't move on. They just wait, patiently lurking in the absolute silence, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to turn off the lights and close their eyes.